I told you last week that in week 2 of Bad Relationship Advice, we were going to be talking about sex. And my wife told me on the way home, we were sitting in the car, and she said, you know, I don't love it when you talk about sex on Sunday mornings. And I said, why is that? She said, because I feel like on my way out, everyone's looking at me, and they're like, and that's the person who has sex with him. So I feel like our children have given that away already. And she was like, she's like, I'll come. I don't love it. Then 2 days ago, my 6-year-old came down with 102-degree fever. But she's very excited that she gets to stay home and help him today. So she's not here. Sweetie, if you're online, I love you. And thanks for letting me tell everyone about your concerns. All right, so we're in week 2 of Bad Relationship Advice, and this is what we're going to talk about today, okay? The name of the sermon is Sexual Formation in a Hookup Culture, Sexual Formation in a Hookup Culture. So this is an odd message. It's going to be a ton of information. I didn't want you to mostly hear from me on this. I wanted you to mostly hear from a ton of other people. So I've got a lot of quotes, a lot built in today, and we're gonna go quickly, but it's gonna go up online. We've got a resource page as well that we're putting out this week for you, and we're hoping that you can have some great conversation with some of your small groups as you walk through this as well. So sexual formation and hookup culture. First of all, I just want to say this: if you're here today and you're not sure if you're a follower of Jesus yet, or you're not sure what you think about Christianity or your faith, it's a good day to be here. Because we may talk about things in a different way than the culture around you has typically talked about them. And a lot of times when people think about Christianity, when it comes to talking about sex, they think of like God being basically a giant killjoy in the sky who's just looking to make sure that you have a bad time. Here's what I want you to know. Jesus really does not prescribe a book of rules, but a way of life. His goal is not that you follow like, A, B, C, D, E, like you're checking off all the lists. His goal is that you would live a life full of purpose, that you would live a life full of meaning, that you would connect with God and that you would connect with other people. That's his hope. So when we talk, unfortunately, we will talk about exactly how in a few minutes. Unfortunately, the church has at times in its history done a really bad job of talking about sex and thinking about sex. But also what I want you to hear today is I think that our culture today is doing a really bad job of thinking about sex as well. So the question for Jesus isn't just like, what can I do, what can't I do? The question for Jesus really is, who am I becoming? Who am I becoming? So before we get really jumped in and started today, first of all, credit where credit is due. A few years ago, I heard a message by a pastor who I've met a couple times now and really appreciate. He's in New York City, and his name is John Tyson. And he did a message on sexual formation that I thought was very, very helpful. So I am borrowing liberally from John Tyson's outline and some of his resources today. Obviously, added a few of my own thoughts in here too and put a little spin on it. But I just want to give credit to him for being very helpful for me as I constructed this message today. We want to start with some scripture. In the book of Matthew in chapter number 5, Jesus is speaking and we read this. He says, "You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away." So Jesus says, look, it's better not to enter into sin than to enter into sin, even if it costs you a body part. Now, he's speaking in hyperbole. So if you're new to this Jesus thing, don't just start gouging out your eye. Wait for the service to finish, okay? We've got more to this, okay? He goes on and he says this: "It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." In other words, look, there's a way of living in which you will experience hell, a separation from God. That's what hell is. You'll experience hell in this lifetime and the lifetime to come. And I don't want you to go down that path, he says. It's way better for you not to go down that path. So if your hand, even your strong hand, if that causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If the absence of God, and therefore the absence of your Creator, is something that you will face as the ultimate consequence, it's better to lose parts of your body than to actually face that. I was 13 years old the first time I saw pornography. I was in the locker room. I was in 7th grade, and we had a football game on a Friday night. And so on that particular day of athletics, like during our class time period, we were just going to rest. The coaches just came in and told us, you guys can just hang out for these 45 minutes because you got a game tonight. We want you to be fresh for the game. And I remember that someone had taken a page out of a Playboy magazine, and just a single page. They had torn it out and they had placed it in somebody's locker in the locker room. And I remember that person found it and started passing it out, and we all looked at it. It was the first time I'd ever seen something like that before. It was a couple of years later when I was over at a friend's house, and he had received from somebody else a bootleg VHS tape. VHS tape was like, it looked like a cassette tape, but it was bigger. It had video on it. And he found a bootleg VHS tape that someone had given him, and it had one scene from a pornographic movie on it. And we watched that, and I'd never seen anything like it before. And then a couple years later, I was over at another friend's house, and their parents thought they had blocked Cinemax, but their parents had not blocked Cinemax. And so at like 2 a.m, we turned on a Cinemax adult film as well. Obviously, the moral of this story is never let your kids hang out with friends. Doesn't end well. So from the time that I was, 13 to the time I was 18, I had seen like 1 pornographic picture and 2 pornographic videos. That was my complete exposure to it. The internet was around at that point, but it was still very much in its infancy. Loading videos or even images or even like websites like NBA.com, like it just took forever to load up. So internet porn wasn't nearly as big in the 90s as it is now. So 1 image and 2 videos from the time I was 13 to the time I was 18, and that is just a drop in the bucket compared to what kids are exposed to now. An article came out in the New York Times a couple of years ago called What Teenagers Are Learning from Online Porn. And this article in my circles was like a big wake-up call for a lot of people because they just didn't realize how much exposure their kids were having to this. What they decided to do in New York was to actually create a porn literacy class for students to come participate in so that they could start to understand the differences between realistic depictions of sex in pornography and super unhealthy, violent, unrealistic depictions of sex in pornography. So this is from the article. This says this: for around 2 hours each week for 5 weeks, the students, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, they take part in porn literacy, which aims to make them savvier, more critical consumers of porn by examining how gender, sexuality, aggression, consent, race, queer sex, relationships, and body images are portrayed, or in the case of consent, not portrayed in porn. Whereas I didn't have much exposure when I was a kid, and my father and his father and his father would have had almost zero exposure to this kind of thing when they were a kid. Nowadays, our culture is immersed in sex and depictions of sex. In fact, what's happened is that the sexual revolution, which started in the 60s and into the 70s, it really took hold. And if a revolution is the overthrow of something, the sexual revolution overthrew what we thought of as traditional sexual values in our culture. To such a degree, in fact, that Mary Eberstadt says this. She's talking about the sexual revolution, and she says, the destigmatization and demystification of non-marital sex and the reduction of sexual relations in general to a kind of hygienic recreation in which anything goes so long as those involved are consenting adults. That's her definition of the sexual revolution. That really what has replaced any idea that sex is bigger than just physical gratification. Like we used to talk about it like, oh, sex has a lot more meaning than that. It's a lot more connecting than that. It's a lot more relationally than that. Now in our culture today, basically anything goes as long as there are 2 consenting adults involved. It's been destigmatized, she said, and demystified. That's the sexual revolution. And, the stats regarding porn, premarital sex, abortion, divorce, living together before marriage, this is what they clearly show. Christians and non-Christians live almost identical lives. There's almost no difference between how a Christian lives sexually in this culture and how a non-Christian lives. And in fact, I understand that the church at times has really been unhelpful when it comes to talking about sex. And some of the puritanical values have bordered on psychopathy at times, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But at the same time, the opposite ditch of that has to be that sex is nothing more than just a muscle spasm, basically. It's nothing more than physical gratification. And what we find is that in all this sexual freedom that we've introduced into our society is actually more lonely and more disconnected than we've ever been before. Sex is eating us alive. It's eating us alive. And so I think the question is, what do we do with that? And I think that as followers of Jesus, right, for those of us who choose to follow after Jesus, it's been confusing, in part because there's been this myth that a lot of us have probably heard before, and it's the myth that just says that all sin is the same. How many of you have heard some version of that? Not that you believe it necessarily, that you've heard it. Yeah. The problem is Jesus disagrees with it. And the scriptures disagree with this. Scripture actually teaches that sexual sin is a different type of sin. And I don't mean that every other sin is no big deal and sexual sin is a big deal. I'm just saying that the scripture teaches that sexual sin is a big deal. There's other sins that are as well. But the reason it's a big deal is not just because God declared that it was so, but because the result of treating something that's so good and holy and sacred as something that's so expendable. The results are drastic. And so we read this in 1 Corinthians 6. The Apostle Paul is writing, and he's one of the first Christians, and he says this: "You say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I'm allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything." It's easy to become a slave to all kinds of stuff. He goes on, "You say food was made for the stomach and the stomach for food. And this is true, though someday God will do away with both of them." He's just talking about when Jesus returns and everything gets renewed, restored, and reconciled. He goes on, "But you can't say that our bodies were made for sexual immorality. They were made for the Lord, and the Lord cares about our bodies. Don't you realize that your bodies are actually parts of Christ? Should a man take his body, which is part of Christ, and join it to a prostitute? Never. And don't you realize that if a man joins himself to a prostitute, he becomes one body with her?" And then he goes on to say why that matters. "For the scriptures say, the two are united into one. But the person who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. Run from sexual sin," he says. "No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body." In other words, look, there's lots of sins that you commit outside of your body. This is sin against your own body, and therefore it has bodily damaging effects and psychological effects. Like, this has lots and lots of effects that some sins just don't, right? And so this is not off limits because God is a cosmic killjoy. This is treat this in the way it was created to be treated, because that's how you'll have the best life. He goes on, "Don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. So you must honor God with your body." Now, the thing is, this is obviously like this kind of pragmatic approach and frankly, high view of sex is just not what our culture holds to. The sexual revolution has shifted that. So I think the question is, like, if we're not going to hold to a very high view of sex and be somewhat awe-inspired by the creation of sex, like, what does that do for us? Where does the sexual revolution lead us? Where has it led us? Mary Eberstadt returns and she says this: "First, and contrary to conventional depiction, the sexual revolution has proved a disaster for many men and women. And second, its weight has fallen heaviest on the smallest and weakest shoulders in society, even as it has given extra strength to those already strongest and most predatory." And we'll see why that is in just a little bit as we talk about issues like pornography and extramarital sex and Tinder. It's going to be a fun morning. I mean, I'm stoked to be here. I'm sure you are too. Before we move on, one thing that I need to say that is very, very important, because especially if you've had a bad church experience when it comes to this topic or really any topic, okay? I just want to tell you what my goal is here, and I want you to know I am not here to produce shame, okay? So if you're a follower of Jesus, what we're going to talk about today are ways that Jesus invites us to be formed in our discipleship, even when it comes to sex. How are we being spiritually formed by the way that we think about and engage with the idea of sex? And if you're not a follower of Jesus, then you may be living very differently than what we talk about today. And I'm not here to judge you for that. I don't expect people who aren't trying to follow Jesus to live their life as if they're trying to follow Jesus. Does that make sense? Like, if that's you, like, you're not sure where you are yet, then this is okay. But you'll get to have a front row seat today, or fifth row, or eighth, wherever you decide to sit. You'll get to have a seat today to see how it is that followers of Jesus wrestle with topics like this. And I hope that that's helpful. So let me talk about two ditches when it comes to sex, one that the church has fallen into and one that the culture has fallen into. These are both overreactions, okay? The first one is fear. The church has fallen into a ditch of fear when it comes to talking about sex, so we have either not done it at all or we have done it very poorly. The culture has fallen into like this freedom trap, that the most important thing is just freedom. Everybody's William Wallace from Braveheart when it comes to this topic in our culture, okay? It's all about freedom, two consenting adults, that's it, let's go, let's go. So we're going to talk both of these things. Let's talk about fear first. And I want to start by telling you about a 4th century theologian named Jerome, which I know is basically why you all came here today, to hear about Jerome. So Jerome actually translated the Old Testament and the New Testament into Latin. By the time he was in his 30s, he was probably the greatest Christian theologian in all of the world. I mean, this guy was brilliant. Here was Jerome's problem. Jerome struggled with lust his whole life, and I mean deeply, deeply struggled. Like, as much as he wanted to get a hold of it and wanted to get a grip of it, he almost seemed to have had perhaps maybe even a psychological problem happening at a very high level where he just couldn't let go of it. So I'm going to read you a couple things that he wrote They're not great. They're not the worst examples, though, but I just wanted to give you kind of an insight, because he would try everything. He would try fasting. He tried prayer. He tried just burying himself in his studies, anything he could, but still he had this lust in his heart. So this is one of the things he writes. He says, "My face was pale with fasting, but though my frame was chilled, my mind was burning with desire, and the fires of lust flared up while my flesh was barely alive." He ended up being so consumed by his own personal struggle with lust and desire that he started to see all sex, all of it, as inherently bad. And so even when it came to sex within marriage or wedlock, he started to see that as fairly bad. In fact, all he had to say positive about wedlock was this: "I praise wedlock, I praise marriage, but it is because they give me virgins." Not him personally, for him, his own virgins, but they fill the world with virgins. And remember, in his mind, if sex is bad, then the most pure you can be when it comes to sex is to just not have it at all. So sex is good, and then it creates more virgins, and virgins are good because sex is bad. You with me? Okay, let's keep going. "I gather the rose from the thorns," he says, "the gold from the earth, the pearl from the shell." He even says this: "Anyone who is too passionate a lover with his own wife is himself an adulterer." Well, that's terrible advice. Talk about bad relationship advice. Like, yeah. Several of you very vocal about that. Yes. No, this obviously, this is a man who had a personal struggle, and because of his personal struggle, right, he made some very strong moral rules around it. But it had a major, massive influence on the early church because this was one of their best and brightest theologians. He even got to a point, by the way, where he started to assign spiritual value to women based on how much sex they had or had not had. So he would say like a virgin is 100 points, and someone who's married is 30 points, and a widow is 60 points, because at least they're not having sex anymore, right? Like this, that's where he took it. And so his fear ends up being taken and run with. St. Augustine, similar. He believed that Adam and Eve, that the original sin, the original temptation in the garden was sexual temptation. And so the whole church is getting these very mindful, thoughtful, weird theologians who are starting to speak like this. And what happens? Well, fear crept inside the church. Fear crept inside the church, and the church started to respond to this. So by the time we get to the Middle Ages, they had all these edicts that they had released on when you could not have sex, even within the confines of a monogamous marriage. So by the time you get to the Middle Ages, there's no sex on, Thursdays, because that was the day that Christ was arrested. No sex on Fridays, because that was the day of Christ's death. No sex on Saturdays, to honor the Blessed Virgin. No sex on Sundays, because you got to honor the departed saints. No sex the 40-day fast periods before Easter, Christmas, and Pentecost. And no sex on the feast days, the days of the apostles. Some of them even took out Wednesdays or, during a menstruation cycle. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, most theologians believe that there were only 44 days out of the calendar year where any married couple could have blessed by God marital sex. Then you wonder why they call it the Dark Ages. And this is where we went with this. The idea seemed to be moral standards plus willpower equals holiness. If we can just have the right standards and if we just gut it out, that is what will make us holy. So did it work? No, it did not work. Philip Yancey writes this: "I know of no greater failure among Christians than in presenting a persuasive point of view on sexuality. Outside the church, people think of God as the great spoil sport of human sexuality, not its inventor. In a sex-saturated society, even true believers find it hard to accept that traditional Christian morality offers the fullest, most satisfying life. The Pope utters pronouncements, denominations issue position papers, and many Christians ignore them and follow the lead of the rest of society." In fact, he goes on to say, "Surveys reveal little difference between church attenders and non-attenders in the rates of premarital intercourse and cohabitation. Surveys also show that millions of people have left the church in disgust over its hypocrisy about sex, especially when priests and ministers fail to practice what they preach." And let me just tell you, as a pastor, how upsetting it is for me to see week after week when the next article comes out about some pastor of some large church in some state somewhere that had a giant moral failure again. Like, you're going to teach about the sanctity of marriage and the wonderful creation of sex within the marital confines. You're going to teach about that, and then you're going to live your life in a very different way. And of course, that kind of hypocrisy makes people angry. It makes me angry. Because people just stop believing what you have to say. And frankly, if we got to a place where we started to think that moral standards plus willpower equals holiness, what we've actually found out is that moral standards plus willpower equals failure. Like if that's all you have, if that's the way you think about it, you will fail. So that's a little on the church's discussion on sex when it comes like to the ditch that they're in, which is fear. What about freedom? Because this is more the culture, right? And this phrase that's been coined, right? The way that the culture thinks that we should move forward is through absolute freedom. There's even a term for it called sex positivity, right? We want to have positivity about sex. And yet this hasn't necessarily led to good results. So we read this from Carol Queens, who's a sexologist, and she's just kind of explaining to us a sex-positive kind of mindset. She says this: it's a simple yet radical affirmation that we each grow our own passions on a different medium, that instead of having 2 or 3 or even half a dozen sexual orientations, we should be thinking in terms of millions. Sex-positive respects each of our unique sexual profiles, even as we acknowledge that some of us have been damaged by a culture that tries to eradicate sexual difference and possibility. So sex positivity as a cultural phenomenon that's happening all around us basically looks at Christians, followers of Jesus, especially those who are spouting more of a fear understanding, and simply ask the question, why are you so uptight about sex? Sex positivity believes that desire plus consent equals freedom. It equals freedom. So how's that working out for us? Spoiler alert, not well. Here's an article from the New York Times called What's Lust Got to Do with It? And in it, the author of the article, Joanna Cole, says this: getting naked and having sex with strangers is hard. We portray it as fun and we pretend it's fun, but people crave intimacy, which is not easy to create in a hookup. That's why Britain just appointed a loneliness minister. And I read this and my first thought was, whoa, hold up. Britain has a loneliness minister? Britain has a loneliness minister, okay? Like, how? Why? Why do they have a loneliness minister? They have a loneliness minister because they have found that within their society, people are more lonely and disconnected than they've ever been before. And they have someone at the highest levels of government trying to find a solution to this problem. The United States would probably have one, but, inflation, gas prices, we're working on it, okay? But we don't have it just yet. But it's a problem in all Western societies right now. It's not just the UK. It's not just the UK. This is what Nancy Pierce, author of Love Thy Body, a great book, by the way. This is one of 2 that I'm going to highly recommend. Should be required reading. She says this: the same bleak view of sexuality is inculcated in even young children. A video put out by Children's Television Workshop, widely used in sex education classes, defines sexual relations as simply something done by 2 adults to give each other pleasure. Right? No mention of marriage or family or even love or commitment. No hint that sex has a richer purpose than sheer sexual gratification. So the culture has decided that desire plus consent equals freedom. But what we're finding from the results, right, the disconnectedness, the loneliness, is actually the desire plus consent equals disillusionment. That's what it equals. So where do we go here? We've got fear on the one side, which obviously feels problematic, but we've got this freedom on the other side. And that word sounds really good, but when we see the results, it's not actually been good. See, I think Jesus provides a third way between the failure of sexual fear and the disillusionment of sexual freedom. And that's what I want us to just dive into for the last part today. Jesus does not prescribe us a book of rules, remember, but a way of life. And it's important for us then in this context to understand that with Jesus, it's not fear and it's not freedom, but formation. When it comes to the way that you are living your life sexually, thinking about sex, like there is a formational aspect to that. So what kind of person are you becoming? Because the way you think about this topic, the way you engage with it, will very much be a part of either forming or deforming the person you are becoming. This is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The Apostle Paul writes this: God's will is for you to be holy, so stay away from all sexual sin. Then each of you will control his own body and live in holiness and honor, not in lustful passion like the pagans who do not know God and his ways. So control, actually having control is a big part of this. Never harm or cheat a fellow believer in this matter by violating his wife, for the Lord avenges all such sins. And we have solemnly warned you before, God has called us to live holy lives, not impure lives. Therefore, Anyone who refuses to live by this instruction is not disobeying human teaching, but is rejecting God who gives his Holy Spirit to you. So there's a couple of things when it comes to sexual formation in this passage. One is learning control, and two is submitting to the Holy Spirit. There's a learning control, learning to say no sometimes, like that's important. And then there's a submitting to the Holy Spirit, and that's really, really important. So we're going to control parts of our lives, and we're going to try to work with the Holy Spirit of the Lord in order to do that and to go forward. Okay, so to actually think then about what Christian sexual formation is, I think there's 4 major components that Tyson talks about, and I think that they're really helpful. So here they are. First of all, if we're thinking about sex in a formational way, it's the story we long for. It's the story we long for. In other words, we long to be fully known by someone else. When we're entering into sex with somebody, we long to be fully known by someone else, and we long to fully know someone else. We long to be grasped by someone else, and we long to fully grasp them. We want people to see us exactly like we are, all of us, with all of our flaws and everything, and still accept us and love us. Ultimately, that's what's at the bottom of sex. That's what we hope for when it comes to sex. And Christianity is like the only story, the gospel is the only story where God sees you exactly as you are, exactly as you were created, exactly with all of the good and the bad and the mess in your life, with all of it, and says, I love you. I love you. You don't have any idea how much I love you. That's the gospel. And when we have a right picture of sex, we see that like it's actually an echo. It's like a foretaste. It's a sign pointing to the thing that we long the most, which is to be known. It's the story that we long for. Philip Yancey, in his book Rumors from Another World, he says it this way: the very word sex comes from a Latin verb that means to cut off or sever. And sexual impulses drive us to unite, to restore somehow the union that has been severed. Freud diagnosed the deep pain within us as a longing for union with a parent. Jung diagnosed a longing for union with the opposite sex. But the Christian sees a deeper longing for union with the God who created us. So what we see as we look into the Gospels is not Freud and not Jung, but it's like actually sex has something to do with the God who created you, the God who longs for you. So that's the story we long for. But Christian sexual formation is also about a holistic integration. It's about a holistic integration. In other words, like the way that we think about our sex lives is really, really important because it will form how we are in our heads. There was a movie that came out a number of years ago where Russell Crowe plays a mathematician named John Nash. It's a movie called A Beautiful Mind, and he's an absolute brilliant mathematician in this movie. But in this movie, he is terrible with emotional intelligence. Like, he cannot strike up a conversation with anybody. So he's in this bar in one of these scenes, and this girl from across the way kind of, she makes eyes at him. And his friends are like, hey, that girl's making eyes at you. And, he looks over at her, and she's doing this. It's really creepy, actually. And so he's like, oh, and they're like, hey, go get her, go talk to her, right? But he does not know how to woo people. So he walks over to her, and he says this: I don't know exactly what I'm required to say for you to have intercourse with me, but could we assume that I said all that? I mean, essentially, we're just talking about fluid exchange, right? So could we just go straight to the sex? See, we kind of know in our heart of hearts that sex isn't just about sex. But when we boil it all down to just physical gratification, then it no longer plays a holistic part in our life, and it just becomes about technique. It's why when you go to the grocery store, all the magazines, right, will tell you how to have a great sex life. 100 best sex tips, 25 sizzling sex adventures, hands-on sex tips from a pro. You'll find people trying to tell you how to have great sex all over the place. Just, not everybody is actually as good at it as they try to say that they are, okay? So, you'll find all about technique everywhere. It's everywhere. But it's not part of a holistic integration of who we actually are. So we got to think about it more holistically than that. A third pillar of Christian sexual formation, it's tied to our transformation. It's tied to our transformation. A big part of parenting is teaching our children impulse control. Teaching them how to not do the thing right this second at the volume that they want to, right here, right now, okay? It's impulse control. Not everything that you want to do is the best thing for you at the time. Example, on Friday, I bought a fairly large bag of double-stuffed Oreos. I set them on the counter. Within 4 hours, my family had eaten that entire bag of Oreos. And the lesson I learned was, don't set them on the counter, hide them so the rest of the family doesn't know you got them, right? That's the lesson I learned. But what do I want? I do want to eat that whole bag of double-stuffed Oreos. Did you know that 2 double-stuffed Oreos is 170 calories? Yeah, I did. I knew that. I still ate a bunch of them, right? I know that that's not the best for me. That is not the best for me, but I did it anyway. We have these impulses a lot of times that actually aren't the best for us. Like, you want to say that thing to that person, but you actually know deep down, like, that this is not the time or the place, or maybe you should never say that out. You should think about it and figure out a different, better, less painful, more constructive way to say it. We have impulses all the time. It seems like when it comes to sex, and almost sex alone in our society, have we decided that impulse control is just completely nonsense. Like, all you have to do is have 2 consenting adults, and then whatever else, like, it just flies. Here's what actually trying to control ourselves, though, not just sexually, but holistically can do, right? It can repress the worst in us and release the best in us. And when it comes to sex, impulse control ends up being hugely important. You will form your character, or you will deform your character. So it is absolutely, the way that we think about this, just like so many other things, it is tied to our transformation. And finally, it's a witness to the world. It's a witness to the world. Like, the way that we behave collectively as a church, as followers of Jesus, sexually, like, is a witness to the world about whether we treat people as mere objects of pleasure or as human beings with the dignity and the value, the worth that God has granted them, created them for. Like, it's absolutely a statement to the world. All right, so we're going to talk about pornography, dating, and kintsugi, and then we're done, okay? Aren't you glad you came this morning? Okay, first we're going to talk about pornography. I just want to read this quote by Jane Meza. The more society loses touch with reality, especially in relationships, the more people do not know how it is supposed to be, how to react with other people, the more they turn to porn. And I would say this, I don't know of a single other topic that has caused more tension and more shame for more men and women in the United States today than the issue of pornography. I include myself in that, by the way. I struggled with porn in my 20s. Some psychologists would tell you that you can't get addicted to porn. It can only become compulsive. I still have a hard time understanding what the actual definition or the difference is between compulsive and addictive, but it sure felt addictive to me. I had a hard time not returning to it over and over and over again. And so I get this. I understand turning to this. She goes on to say this. They look at this fantasy and they believe it should be their reality. They retreat further and further into their illusion because porn can never be real. It does not work in real life. Porn is a sickness. In his book, Empire of Illusion, Chris Hedges says this. By the way, if there's one book you grab from today, this would be the one I would recommend. Empire of Illusion. It's really, really good. Required rating. It's fantastic. He says this. The largest users of internet porn are between the ages of 12 and 17. And porn producers are increasingly targeting adolescents. Porn targets the mid-teens to the mid-20s. Later on in this same chapter, he does an interview with several former porn stars. I'm about to read you a fairly lengthy excerpt from one of those interviews, and it's a bit crass, and I'm going to apologize for that, but I wanted the full force of it to hit you today. Because here's what I know. One of the things that helped me get out of a porn addiction or a porn compulsion was that I started to learn more about the industry. And at that, like, I already had shame over it. Like, I just had shame over it. I did. I deeply felt every time. And yet, when I started to find out more about the industry and how it actually treats the people who work within the industry, I started to get to a place where I was like, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to support that with my advertising dollars or with my clicks or with anything like that. I just don't want anything to do with that. So this is an interview that he does with a former porn star. I apologize for the crassness, but I hope that it's helpful to see like the reality of what they're dealing with. She says this, you have to do what they want on the sets. There's too much competition. They can always find other girls. Girls bring in their friends and they get kickbacks. They feel like stars. They get attention. It's all about the spotlight. It's all about me, right? They have notoriety. They don't realize the degradation. Besides, this is a whole generation raised on porn. They're jaded and they don't even ask if it's wrong. They fall into it. They get into drugs to numb themselves. They get their asses ripped, their uterus hemorrhages. They've got HPV and herpes and they turn themselves off emotionally and die. They check out mentally. They get PTSD like Vietnam vets. They don't know who they are. They live a life of shopping and drugs. They don't buy real estate. They party. And in the end, they have nothing to show for it except, like me, genital herpes and fake boobs. I'm going to flip to the black screen because if you take a picture while I'm walking around, I don't want it to say genital herpes behind me, okay? Recent survey of 16 to 18-year-olds found that the vast, vast majority of them said that they were learning about how to have sex primarily from pornography. That's not surprising, but it is heartbreaking. Because here's what we know about porn. Our bodies, we have these like joy centers essentially. And it's where we see certain things and it gives us joy, it delights us. It literally releases a chemical in our brain called dopamine. And that makes us feel good and excited. And therefore, we want to return to that over and over again because whenever we get that dopamine hit, that feels good. Some people get it when they run long distances. I mean, not me, but some people do. Right? Dopamine release, they call it a runner's high, right? And so they keep running because they want to get back to that place. But we pretty much all have it hardwired into us when it comes to sexual activity. And so when we see a sex act being performed, or when we ourselves are sexually gratified, dopamine releases, and it's like we're a part of it. And so we want to come back to it over and over again because it literally, like watching porn a lot, literally rewires our brains, our neural pathways. It changes the way our brain works. Here's the thing. What gets us on a high in one instance, like that exact same picture, image, or video will not get us as high again in weeks and months to come. And so the video that someone found really enticing, at one point in their life, the porn video, like weeks, months, years later, they don't find as enticing anymore. You need the porn to get increasingly extreme for your mind to register the same level of dopamine hit. It is very much like a drug addiction. And so what happens is like the porn industry in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it starts to majorly shift when it gets to the 2000s, and they start releasing increasingly extreme videos. Those increasingly extreme videos go increasingly mainstream, to where much of the porn that you find today also mixes in with it a high dose of misogyny and violence. There's a lot of violence. And the more your brain starts to associate sex with violence, the more rewired it becomes to put those two things together, and the less gentle of a lover you become. And the more extreme things you have to keep seeing in order to keep getting the same kind of high over and over and over again. We are now around a generation that for the very first time has been raised marinating itself in pornography. And in interviews, like there are I read a whole lot of articles and a number of books for this particular message. I can't tell you how many articles I read that interviewed teenage girls. These are high schoolers, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. And over and over and over again, I read about how their boyfriends were forcing them to reenact things that they had learned in pornography, badgering them into uncomfortable sexual positions, or doing things that they found personally gross or distasteful, or pretending to enjoy it far more than they did because that's the expectation because all of their peers are watching porn. Like, it's become a major problem. And it's not just a problem for teens, it's a problem for adults as well because, again, what you look at and how you think about this stuff, it warps and deforms in some cases, the kind of person you are and the kind of outlook that you have. John Paul II said this: there is no dignity when the human dimension is eliminated from the person. In short, the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much of the person, but that it shows far too little. If all we're looking at is bodies and sex, and we're just making objects out of people, we're not seeing their actual humanness in there. So that's a bit on pornography. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about dating. Now, I have personally never used a dating app in my life, okay? I am 40 years old, and I got married when I was 21 years old. iPhones didn't even exist when I got married, okay? I know for some of you, that seems unbelievable, but yes, it's true. So there were no dating apps when I was dating. Like, you just had to actually, meet someone somewhere, talk a little bit, and propose the same day. That's how it went. That's how old I am. So a friend of John Tyson's explained it to him this way. He said, dating apps are like Amazon Prime to deliver you hot people, okay? So if you're not familiar with dating apps, now you kind of have an idea, okay? This is kind of how they work. There's actually an article that came out a couple of years ago in Vanity Fair. You can still access it online. And the article is called Tinder and the Dawn of the Dating Apocalypse. Okay? And I just want to share with you some fairly lengthy excerpts from this article because, again, I just think a lot of us need to understand where the culture is today. Because if you're 40, 50, even 60 years old, like right now, the culture shifted dramatically even since you were in your 20s. And if you're a teenager moving into your 20s, I just want to show you what's depicted versus what is real. What seems like it's footloose and fancy-free and freedom, but it's actually devastating to people. So in this article, we read a number of things. Here's one. There have been two major transitions in heterosexual mating in the last 4 million years, he says. In the last two. Here's what they are. The first was around 10,000 to 15,000 years ago in the agricultural revolution when we became less migratory and more settled, leading to the establishment of marriage as a cultural contract. And the second major transition is with the rise of the internet. Okay, so let's just break this down for a second. The Bible doesn't say anything about dating, because when the Bible was written, nobody dated. There were arranged marriages. And arranged marriages ended up turning into courtships over the years. Courtship was when, you fancy a girl, and so you're like, oh, I'd love to go out. And what you mean is you want to come over, because you've got to meet her family. And you have to show her family what kind of care you would take of her and what your character was like. And that was courtship. The family had to be convinced that you were a worthwhile mate for their daughter. That was courtship. It's not until about the year 1914 that we start regularly seeing the term dating appear. And dating starts to take the place of courtship. What once had been a foundation built on friendship, right? You get to know someone over time, you get to know their family. Like, it became a foundation instead on romance. What once had been a foundation on character, right? The family gets to know you. They decide if your character is good enough to marry their daughter. Now became a foundation on how much money you can spend on them and how much fun you can have and who all can see you out in public. It's just drastically shifted. And I'm not saying that there's no pros compared to cons when it comes to dating. I dated, you probably dated. Like, there are great things to have in a healthy dating relationship. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is, like, it's been a major, major shift. In 4 million years, there's only been 2 major shifts. One was 15,000 years ago when we started having contractual marriages. The other one was like a decade ago. So if you find yourself confused about all this, of course you are. We haven't dealt with a transition this big in 15,000 years. Most of us don't even remember back that far. Some of you are getting close. So of course it's tough. Of course it's difficult. So this we go on, we read this in the article. Guys view everything as a competition. This is a gentleman that they interviewed. He elaborates with his deep, reassuring voice. Who slept with the best, hottest girl? With these dating apps, he said, you're always sort of prowling. Another guy says this, you can talk to 2 or 3 girls at a bar and pick the best one, or you can swipe a couple hundred people a day. The sample size is so much larger. It's setting up 2 or 3 Tinder dates a week, and chances are sleeping with all of them, so you could rack up 100 girls you've slept with in a year. They also start to unpack some different terms that people are familiar with. One was Tenderella. This is a girl you meet and land before midnight. Another was Tender King. This is a guy who can get a woman into bed with a very strong text game or perhaps only using emojis. Go on and you start to read, again, some more of the men and women who have participated in this. Another one says this, I sort of play that I could be a boyfriend kind of guy in order to win them over, but then they start wanting me to care more, and I just don't. Because that's not what he's there in the first place. Someone else said it's like ordering Seamless, but you're ordering a person. A woman said this, it's rare for a woman of our generation to meet a man who treats her like a priority instead of an option. Another woman named Reese says this, they start out with send me nudes, or they say something like, I'm looking for something quick within the next 10 or 20 minutes. Are you available? Okay, you're a mile away. Tell me your location. It's straight efficiency. Another woman says, if he texts you before midnight, he actually likes you as a person. If it's after midnight, it's just for your body. Another guy bragged about it this way. He said, I hooked up with 3 girls thanks to the internet off of Tinder, and in the course of 4 nights, I only spent a total of $80 on all 3 girls. There's another longer section where the author of this article, Tinder and the Dawn of the Dating Apocalypse, the author of this article talks about a man named Nick that they met, and they write this. Nick, with his lumbersexual beard and hipster clothes, as if plucked from the wardrobe closet of girls, is physically speaking a modern male ideal. That he fulfills none of the requirements identified by evolutionary psychologists as what women supposedly look for in mates. He's neither rich nor tall. He also lives with his mom. Okay. Doesn't seem to have any effect on his ability to get rampantly laid. In his iPhone, he has a list of more than 40 girls he has had relations with, rated by 1 to 5 stars. It empowers them, he jokes. It's a mix of how good they are in bed and how attractive they are. One woman gave this story. She said, I had sex with a guy, and he ignored me as I got dressed, and I saw he was back on Tinder, already looking, right? A few young women admitted to me that they use dating apps as a way to get free meals. I called it Tinder food stamps, they said. Okay. Now, I realize some of you are deleting an app from your phone right now, but if you could look up here for just a second. Okay. So here's probably the question. Well, Josh, what are you saying? That Tinder is just like flat out, full stop wrong? No, not saying that. I'm saying this. I want you to understand that these apps and the people you find in them are working their hardest to set off your dopamine levels and get you hooked and entrenched as quickly and as often as possible. That's happening with pornography. It's happening with dating apps. And I think it's probably the rare follower of Jesus with an insanely Christ-like mind that could enter into a set of dating apps like this and come out unscathed and have more influence over those that they meet with than they are influenced by the app and this predatorial viewpoint of the world. See, I think an actual good Christian understanding of sexual formation looks something like this. It's vision, right? A vision for what could be. It's the power of the Holy Spirit. It's practice. It's actually training ourselves to think differently about this over time. And that equals restoration. It equals restoration. Like for many of us, our view of sex or the way that we've been mistreated. And listen, in a room this size, with our online audience, I can tell you this right now. Lots of you, within the sound of my voice, have been sexually abused within your lifetime. I'm so sorry. And it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And some of you have been carrying that around with you for years. And when we talk about the goodness of sexual formation, like that is a topic that doesn't even seem possible to you. Some of you have actually behaved in very predatory ways. Some of you have probably abused other people. There's just, with the breadth of our audience, it's probably true that that's present somewhere. Listen, if you're thinking, like, I am such a sexual failure, if that's you, whether because of something you did or something that was done to you or a history or a past, whatever that is, I just want to remind you that Jesus points us to a God that can fix anything. And that's why I wanted to spend just a minute as we close today talking about kintsugi. Kintsugi is a Japanese art form, and what they do is they take bowls or vases, glassware, that's been broken, shattered into different pieces, and they take precious metals to fuse those pieces back together. And in doing so, it actually makes the pieces even more valuable than they were before. Here's an example of it. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful what they can get out of these things. And I was reminded of this week as I was preparing for this, because I realized for many of us, we've had some kind of experience, or we've participated in an experience sexually, or maybe multiple experiences, or maybe lots of them, and we're just thinking like, okay, the freedom of our culture obviously is leading to more loneliness and isolation and burnout and hurt feelings, and the fear that the church has had is sometimes like just maybe like not want anything to do with that. Like what is this healthy middle way, and how could I even be a part of something like restoration when my personal history is so messed up and mixed up? And I just want to remind you that our God is excellent at putting the pieces back together again. It's a matter of handing him who we are now and allowing the love, grace of Jesus to restore us and to renew us. Jean Vanier says this: we all have to choose between two ways of being crazy. I already love the start of this sentence. The foolishness of the gospel and the nonsense of the values of our world. Like, look, this is not a choice between one crazy thing and one sane thing, or a choice between two sane things. It's a choice between what will seem like two crazy things. Either we have a high view of sex, and therefore we put boundaries around ourselves and how it is that we think about sex in our culture, how it is that we date, how it is that we marry, the kinds of sexual relationship we have within our marriage. Either we have a high view of that because we recognize like it's not just about my own sexual gratification. It's not just about that. Or we go with the culture and we say like, actually anything goes. Nothing matters except for consent. That's it. And I just think that I've seen this lead to enough burnout and brokenness and pain and hurt to say what I'd really like is for us to grasp more of what Jesus offers us in the midst of it. Both options may seem crazy. In our culture, both options may seem crazy. But my hope is that we'll grasp onto what Jesus has for us. Now, I'm about to close this here in prayer. The band is not coming back out because they couldn't find a single closing song about sex today. I know, it's a bummer. Next time. They're going to keep looking, and we'll see if we can get it going next time. If you would like someone to pray for you, we'll have our prayer team up here at the close of our service, and maybe there's something for you or for someone you know around this topic that you would just like some prayer for or some restoration or some healing from, and they would be here and they'd be happy to do that, okay? And I realize that, right, a lot of weeks we give like a triumphant kind of like, God is with you, you have infinite value, like you can go and be a better force of good in the world, and like we leave this place and we high five and we like fist up. And I realize like this week, right, it may not feel as good to walk out of here and be like, yeah, let's go be sexually responsible. Like I know that that's not like a rallying cry for everyone, but I do know this. The world is actually in far more pain, frustration, and loneliness around this topic than they let on. We desperately need to see a group of people who think about it differently, who point them to a way of honoring God with their bodies and their relationships, and see sex not just as sexually gratifying, obviously it is that also, but as a signpost of a thing to come. A larger holistic view of how we could think of the dignity of each and every person. And what our world desperately needs to see increasingly is the dignity of each and every person, because we're getting really good at dehumanizing people, dehumanizing our sexual partners, dehumanizing our political opponents, dehumanizing people who live in the wrong state or in the wrong place or have the wrong ideas. We are dehumanizing everyone, and the church could point people to a better way forward than that, and it is my prayer and hope that we will. Father, thank you for this time together today. Lord, there's a lot of material. It's a lot of stuff. I know it's not as lighthearted as it is a lot of weeks, but God, there's just so much in our culture that is crying out for Jesus to come in and heal and restore. And so, God, I just pray that you would help us to ask the question, who are we becoming? And that we will recognize that even in the ways that we think about and engage with sex or materials on sex or any of that kind of stuff, like we are being formed. We're either being formed in your likeness or deformed to be something that is farther from you. God, would you give us courage to overcome our addictions, our old habits and old way of seeing things, and would you allow us to see the world as you see it and to see others as Jesus sees them, Lord. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. We'll see you next week.